Have you ever wondered how humans truly conquered the planet? Most people imagine a slow, unbroken march across connected landmasses. We picture ancient hunters following migrating herds generation after generation. Step by step, our ancestors spread across Africa, Asia, and Europe. But there is one monumental exception to this rule, a place completely cut off by vast, impassable ocean trenches. A continent that could never, under any circumstances, be reached on foot. Yet, 65,000 years ago, humans arrived there anyway. How did they cross the open ocean before the dawn of civilization? What drove them to leave everything behind and sail into the absolute unknown? This is not just a migration story. This is the greatest, most audacious maritime expedition in human history. To understand the sheer scale of this mystery, we must look at the world as it was 65,000 years ago. Back then, sea levels were lower, but the geography was still unforgiving. Between the mainland of Southeast Asia and the Australian continent lay deep oceanic trenches. These marine barriers had remained completely separate for tens of millions of years. Even at the height of glacial periods, Australia remained an island continent. There was no land bridge to cross. There was no shallow coastal shelf to walk across. Reaching Australia required something revolutionary. It required building something that could float. It required packing enough provisions to survive an open water voyage. It required reading the weather and ocean currents with absolute precision. It meant crossing at least 70 to 90 kilometers of deep, violent ocean. And they had to navigate toward a destination they could not even see. Imagine doing all of that using only stone tools, tens of thousands of years ago. Yet, against all odds, they pulled it off. But who were these daring pioneers? To find out, we have to look back even further, to the emergence of Homo sapiens in Africa. Around 300,000 years ago, modern humans appeared. They were anatomically, neurologically, and cognitively identical to us today. Not almost identical, but completely identical. The exact same brain that built the pyramids and designed space stations was walking through Africa. We often mistakenly view ancient humans as primitive or less capable. They were not. They were just as smart as we are, building their world with different materials. For most of those 300,000 years, our species stayed within Africa. There were earlier, smaller migrations that ventured out into the Middle East. But the great, unstoppable wave of global expansion happened around 70,000 years ago. What triggered this massive exodus? Some researchers believe a planetary catastrophe set things in motion. Around 74,000 years ago, the supervolcano Toba erupted in Sumatra. It was one of the largest volcanic events in human history. Ash choked the skies, plunging the planet into years of severe volcanic winter. Human populations plummeted, creating a severe genetic bottleneck. Then, as the climate finally stabilized, the survivors began to push outward. Whether Toba was the catalyst or not, the great movement had begun. Groups began moving eastward along the southern coast of Asia. These were coastal foragers, people whose entire lives revolved around beaches, estuaries, and the sea. They ate shellfish, caught fish, and mastered the rhythms of tides and currents. They had lived intimately with the water for generations. This is not a guess, but the only geographically logical path for human expansion. By the time these people reached Southeast Asia, they were already crossing water. Island hopping required boats or rafts of some kind. Their journeys started short and grew progressively longer. Generations of maritime experience accumulated over thousands of years. For these people, water was never a barrier. Water was a highway. Now, let us look at the map of the ancient world. 65,000 years ago, sea levels were roughly 40 to 80 meters lower than today. The shallow continental shelf off Southeast Asia was partially exposed, forming a landmass called Sundaland. Borneo, Java, and Sumatra were all connected to the Asian mainland. The islands between Sundaland and Australia were more numerous and closer together. On the other side of the crossing, Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania formed a single massive continent called Sahul. Sahul was 30% larger than modern Australia. Between Sundaland and Sahul lay the island chain known as Wallacea. Named after the 19th century naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, this region is a biological marvel. On the Asian side, you had tigers, elephants, and orangutans. On the Australian side, you had marsupials like kangaroos and wallabies that evolved in complete isolation. Why the sharp contrast? Because deep oceanic trenches prevented these two ecosystems from ever connecting. This invisible marine boundary is Wallace's line, one of the greatest biogeographic barriers on Earth. And this is precisely the barrier the earliest Australians crossed. The most probable route passed through the islands of eastern Indonesia. Travelers moved island by island through what is now the Philippines and eastern Indonesia. Sulawesi served as a major waypoint in this epic journey. From Sulawesi, smaller islands stretched southward toward Timor. From Timor, the rugged coastline of northwestern Australia lay just 90 kilometers across the horizon. On a clear day, under the right conditions, the mountains of Australia were actually visible from the shores of Timor. Even when land was hidden, ancient navigators had other powerful clues. Clouds gathered differently over solid land than over open water. Flocks of birds flew back every evening toward a fixed destination. Southern winds carried the subtle scent of smoke across the waves. These were the signs that seasoned navigators could read effortlessly. They knew something lay beyond the horizon, and they made the fateful decision to find out what it was. What kind of vessels did they use for this impossible voyage? No 65,000-year-old boat has ever been found. Wood decays, bamboo rots, and fibers turn to dust. We will never hold an original vessel in our hands. But we can look at what was available in the tropical rainforests of Southeast Asia. Bamboo grows in abundance across the region. It is lightweight, remarkably buoyant, and surprisingly strong. Bundles of bamboo poles tied together with plant fibers could easily support heavy loads. Experimental archaeologists have built bamboo rafts and successfully crossed similar distances. The technology itself was surprisingly straightforward. But the real challenge was not the boat. The real challenge was psychological and social. Someone had to propose sailing into total emptiness. Someone had to convince others to take that terrifying leap of faith. They had to gather enough food and fresh water for an uncertain duration. They had to time the winds and ocean currents with absolute perfection. They had to maintain morale while drifting for days across a trackless ocean. This required extraordinary leadership, communication, and vision. These were the exact same cognitive tools that would later build cities and launch rockets. Now, imagine what they found when they finally touched land. They entered a continent that had been isolated for nearly 50 million years. Its wildlife had evolved completely untouched by familiar predators. There were no lions, no leopards, no familiar mammals from Africa or Asia. Instead, they encountered giant marsupials of staggering proportions. Meet the Diprotodon, the largest marsupial ever to walk the earth. It looked like a massive, 2.5-ton wombat. Despite its colossal size, it was a peaceful grazer. But because it had no evolutionary history with organized human hunters, it had zero fear. There were giant kangaroos like Procoptodon, standing 2 meters tall and weighing 200 kilograms. There was the Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, possessing one of the most powerful bite forces of any mammalian predator in history. There were giant monitor lizards stretching up to 6 meters in length. Flightless birds taller than humans roamed the open plains. None of these magnificent creatures knew how to fear upright hunters. We see this exact tragic pattern everywhere modern humans arrived in isolated ecosystems. When humans reached the Americas, the megafauna collapsed within millennia. When humans reached isolated Pacific islands, slow-moving animals vanished. The arrival of smart, coordinated predators changed the face of the planet forever. While climate change played a role, the correlation with human arrival is undeniable. Most of Australia's giant animals went extinct within 20,000 years of human contact. But we do not have to rely solely on theory, because archaeology tells the rest of the story. In the Northern Territory of Australia lies a remarkable rock shelter called Madjedbebe. In 2017, archaeologists used optical luminescence dating to analyze deep layers of sediment. The results stunned the scientific world, pushing human presence back to 65,000 years ago. The artifacts found inside were equally extraordinary. thousands of pieces of red, yellow, and orange ochre used for body art and cave painting. Ground-edge stone axes designed to cut wood and shape materials with incredible precision. This advanced stone tool technology appeared in Australia tens of thousands of years before Europe. Thousands of kilometers to the south, near Lake Mungo, even more profound evidence emerged. Archaeologists discovered the remains of a woman who had been meticulously cremated, crushed, and buried. This is the oldest known cremation site on Earth, showcasing complex spiritual beliefs. Nearby, the burial of a man sprinkled with red ochre revealed deep reverence for the afterlife. These were not just people trying to survive. They were members of a rich, deeply spiritual society. Genetic studies have added yet another layer to this astonishing puzzle. Modern Indigenous Australians represent one of the oldest continuous lineages outside of Africa. Their ancestors split from other non-African populations early on and remained largely isolated. But their DNA holds an even bigger secret. Indigenous Australians carry between 4 and 6% Denisovan DNA. This proves that somewhere along their migration path through Wallisa, they met and interbred with Denisovans. They navigated a world inhabited by multiple human species. This was not just an island crossing. It was part of a vast, interwoven human epic. Indigenous Australian culture represents the oldest continuous living culture on Earth, spanning 65,000 years of law, cosmology, and ecological knowledge. Their sophisticated fire management practices shaped entire plant communities across the continent. Oral traditions have preserved accurate geographic memories of coastlines swallowed by rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. Stories passed down by word of mouth across 15,000 years. No other culture in human history can claim such an unbroken transmission of knowledge. 65,000 years ago, brave mariners looked out at the southern horizon and dared to cross the unknown. They discovered a new continent, built a thriving civilization, and left a legacy etched into the very soul of the earth. They were not primitive. They were curious, brilliant, and fearless. They were humanity at its absolute finest. If that is not a story worth telling, nothing is.